In the shadowed corridors of Kensington Palace, where whispers carry more weight than royal decrees, one moment would test the very foundation of duty, loyalty, and moral courage. When protocol demanded silence and hierarchy commanded obedience, a single guard would face an impossible choice that would echo through the halls of British royalty forever. What happens when doing what's right means defying everything you've been trained to respect? What price does loyalty exact when it stands against the very institution you've sworn to serve? In a world where titles determine worth and bloodlines decide destiny, sometimes the most powerful act of defiance comes from the most unexpected source. This is not just another royal story. This is the untold account of how one person's unwavering commitment to protecting an innocent child would challenge centuries of tradition, expose the brutal realities behind palace doors, and prove that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen in the shadows, witnessed by few but felt by many. The crown may command respect, but it takes a human heart to recognize when respect must give way to something far more important: protecting those who cannot protect themselves. James Morrison never imagined that accepting a position as a palace security guard would lead him to question everything he believed about duty, honor, and the price of silence. Standing at 6'2" with shoulders that had carried the weight of military service in Afghanistan, he possessed the kind of steady presence that made nervous royals feel safe and potential threats think twice. His steel-gray eyes had seen enough of the world's darkness to appreciate the privilege of protecting something pure and innocent. The morning of October 15th started, like any other Tuesday at Kensington Palace. James arrived at 5:30, his polished black shoes clicking against the marble floors as he made his way through the security briefing. The autumn air carried a crispness that reminded him of his childhood in Yorkshire, where his grandmother had taught him that a man's character was measured not by what he did when people were watching, but by what he chose to do when no one would ever know. Princess Charlotte, then 8 years old, had become the unofficial sunshine of the palace staff. Unlike the formal interactions most guards experienced with the adult royals, Charlotte possessed an infectious curiosity about everyone around her. She remembered names, asked about families, and had a habit of sneaking extra biscuits from the kitchen to share with the guards during their long shifts. Her laughter echoed through corridors that had seen centuries of political intrigue, bringing a lightness that even the most protocol-obsessed staff members couldn't help but smile at. James had been assigned to Charlotte's detail for 6 months, long enough to witness the complex web of relationships that surrounded the young princess. While the public saw a cherished member of the royal family, James observed something more troubling. There were subtle signs that troubled him. The way certain staff members spoke differently when they thought no one was listening. The hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when Charlotte entered a room. And most concerning of all, the gradual changes in the child's behavior. The princess had begun to withdraw in small ways that might escape casual notice, but were impossible to miss for someone trained to observe details. She asked fewer questions, her laughter came less frequently, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. When James gently inquired about her well-being during one of their informal chats, Charlotte had looked around nervously before whispering that some people in the palace didn't think she belonged in certain places or conversations anymore. The political landscape surrounding the royal family had grown increasingly complex in recent months. Public opinion about the monarchy's relevance fluctuated with each news cycle, and within the palace walls there were factions with different ideas about how to navigate these challenges. Some believed in maintaining absolute traditional protocols, while others advocated for modernization and increased transparency. Unfortunately, these adult disagreements were beginning to impact the children in ways that made James deeply uncomfortable. Lady Margaret Whitmore, a longtime palace administrator with connections dating back decades, had emerged as a particularly influential voice in these internal discussions. Her silver hair was always perfectly arranged, her posture spoke of generations of aristocratic bearing, and her opinions carried the weight of someone who had weathered numerous royal storms. However, James had begun to notice that Lady Whitmore's version of protecting the monarchy's interests seemed to involve treating Princess Charlotte as more of a political liability than a child deserving protection and nurturing. During staff meetings that James occasionally overheard, Lady Whitmore would speak about the need to manage expectations and adjust certain arrangements to better reflect current realities. The language was coded, but the implications became clearer as James observed how these discussions translated into Charlotte's daily life. The princess was being gradually excluded from certain family events. Her schedule was being modified to reduce her public visibility, and there were whispers about reassessing her position within the family structure. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine afternoon. James was stationed outside the library where Charlotte often spent time reading when he heard voices rising in heated discussion from the adjacent conference room. Through the slightly open door, he could see Lady Whitmore speaking animatedly with two other senior staff members, their voices carrying enough for him to catch fragments of their conversation. The words he heard made his blood run cold. They were discussing a plan to significantly alter Charlotte's living arrangements, effectively isolating her from the main family activities under the guise of security concerns and protocol adjustments. The real motivation appeared to be removing what they perceived as a complicating factor in the family's public image. Lady Whitmore was arguing that Charlotte's presence at certain events created unnecessary complications and that her reduced profile would benefit everyone involved. James felt his training kick in as he processed what he was hearing. This wasn't about security or protocol. This was about powerful adults making decisions that would fundamentally alter a child's life based on political calculations rather than her well-being. The implications were staggering. Charlotte would be effectively marginalized within her own family, cut off from the relationships and experiences that were her birthright, all because some adults had decided she was inconvenient to their strategic plans. As he stood there listening to these officials casually discuss reshaping a child's entire existence, James thought about his own daughter back home. Sarah was the same age as Charlotte, and the idea of anyone treating her as a political problem to be managed rather than a precious human being deserving love and protection made him physically ill. The military had taught him to follow orders and respect the chain of command, but it had also taught him that some principles were worth more than career advancement or personal safety. The conversation in the conference room continued, with Lady Whitmore outlining specific steps that would be implemented over the coming weeks. Charlotte would be moved to a different wing of the palace, her daily schedule would be drastically reduced, and her interactions with other family members would be structured and limited. They discussed these plans with the cold efficiency of executives reorganizing a corporation, completely divorced from the emotional reality of what they were proposing to do to an innocent child. James realized that he was witnessing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life if he remained silent. The adults who should have been protecting Charlotte were instead conspiring to abandon her, using their positions of authority to justify what amounted to emotional cruelty disguised as administrative necessity. The weight of this knowledge settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, and he knew that whatever he decided to do next would define not just Charlotte's future, but his own character. Walking back to his post, James tried to imagine explaining to his grandmother why he had chosen to stay silent while a child was being systematically isolated by the very people entrusted with her care. He thought about the oath he had taken when he joined the palace security team, promising to protect the royal family from all threats. The question that tormented him was whether that protection should extend to threats that came from within the palace itself, from people who wore the same uniform of loyalty but had lost sight of what that loyalty should truly serve. The afternoon sun streamed through the palace windows as Princess Charlotte emerged from the library, carrying a book about adventure stories, and wearing the kind of innocent smile that reminded James why his job existed in the first place. She waved at him with the unconscious friendliness that had endeared her to everyone who worked closely with the family, completely unaware that her entire world was about to be turned upside down by adults who claimed to know what was best for her. That evening, as James drove home through the London traffic, he found himself at a crossroads that would determine everything that followed. He could continue following protocol, keeping his head down and his opinions to himself, allowing Lady Whitmore and her allies to proceed with their plan to marginalize Charlotte. It would be the safe choice, the career-preserving choice, the choice that countless others in his position might make without a second thought. Alternatively, he could choose to act on the conviction that some things mattered more than job security or institutional loyalty. He could decide that protecting a child from emotional harm was more important than protecting the adults who were causing that harm. It would be dangerous, potentially career-ending, and would put him in direct conflict with people who wielded considerable power within the royal household. As he pulled into his driveway and saw his own daughter's bicycle leaning against the garage, James Morrison made the decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would begin the most important mission of his life, not protecting a princess from external threats, but protecting a little girl from the people who should have been her greatest champions. The real story was just beginning, and James was about to discover that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to an institution is refusing to let it betray its most fundamental values. The next morning brought a heavy fog that seemed to mirror the uncertainty weighing on James Morrison's mind as he approached Kensington Palace. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the enormity of what he was contemplating. Every rational part of his brain reminded him of the risks: his job, his pension, his reputation, and potentially his freedom if the wrong people decided to make an example of him. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Princess Charlotte's trusting smile and heard Lady Whitmore's cold calculations about managing the child's future like she was a piece on a chessboard rather than a human being with feelings and rights. James had made his decision, but now he faced the practical challenge of how to act on it without making things worse for Charlotte or himself. His military training had taught him the importance of intelligence gathering before any operation, and he recognized that he needed to understand exactly what he was up against before making his first move. The palace was a complex ecosystem of relationships, loyalties, and hidden agendas, and navigating it successfully would require careful strategy rather than impulsive heroics. His first step was to identify potential allies within the palace staff. Over his months of service, James had developed relationships with various employees, from kitchen staff to senior administrators, and he began to pay closer attention to how different people interacted with Princess Charlotte. What he discovered both encouraged and alarmed him in equal measure. Maria Santos, one of Charlotte's tutors, had clearly noticed the changes in the princess's behavior and seemed genuinely concerned about the child's well-being. During a casual conversation over coffee in the staff break room, Maria confided to James that Charlotte had become increasingly withdrawn during their sessions, often staring out the window instead of focusing on her lessons. When Maria had gently asked if something was troubling her, Charlotte had simply said that she didn't think her lessons mattered much anymore because she wouldn't be doing important things in the future. The comment hit James like a physical blow. Somehow, either through overheard conversations or subtle changes in how adults treated her, Charlotte was already beginning to internalize the message that her value and future were being diminished. An 8-year-old child was starting to believe that she wasn't important enough to deserve the same opportunities and attention as other members of her family. The psychological damage was already beginning, even before Lady Whitmore's plan had been fully implemented. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the palace physician who conducted Charlotte's regular health checkups, provided another piece of the troubling puzzle. During a chance encounter in the corridor, Dr. Harper mentioned to James that she had recommended Charlotte spend more time outdoors and engage in more social activities with other children her age. But her suggestions had been dismissed by the administrative staff as not aligned with current protocols. The doctor's frustration was evident as she explained that Charlotte's physical health was fine, but she was showing signs of stress and social withdrawal that concerned her professionally. These conversations confirmed what James had feared. The plan to isolate Charlotte wasn't just something being discussed in conference rooms. It was already being implemented in subtle ways that were affecting the child's emotional and psychological well-being. The adults around her were gradually changing their behavior, preparing her for a reduced role in family life, without ever explicitly explaining what was happening or why. It was a form of emotional manipulation that would have been cruel if directed at an adult, but felt particularly monstrous when the target was a trusting child who had no way to understand or defend herself against it. James also began to pay closer attention to the broader political dynamics within the palace. He learned that Lady Whitmore's influence came not just from her long tenure, but from her connections to certain members of the royal family who shared her conservative views about tradition and public image. These individuals saw Charlotte's situation as potentially problematic for reasons that had nothing to do with the child herself and everything to do with their own anxiety about public perception and media scrutiny. The more James investigated, the more he realized that Charlotte had become a pawn in a larger game of palace politics that she couldn't possibly understand. Powerful adults were making decisions about her future based on their own fears and ambitions, without considering the long-term impact on her development, happiness, or sense of self-worth. It was a betrayal of the most fundamental responsibility that adults have toward children: to protect and nurture them rather than sacrifice them for political convenience. Armed with this understanding, James began to formulate a plan that could potentially protect Charlotte without immediately exposing himself to retaliation. He decided to start by documenting everything he observed, creating a detailed record of conversations, policy changes, and their impact on Charlotte's daily life. If the situation escalated to the point where external intervention became necessary, he would need concrete evidence rather than just his word against established palace officials. The breakthrough came during another overheard conversation, this time between Lady Whitmore and someone James couldn't see clearly. They were discussing the timeline for implementing Charlotte's transition to a more appropriate arrangement, with specific dates mentioned for when various changes would occur. James carefully memorized every detail, realizing that he now had concrete information about their plans rather than just general concerns about Charlotte's treatment. More importantly, the conversation revealed that not everyone within the royal family was supportive of Lady Whitmore's approach. There were references to certain family members who would need to be managed carefully to prevent them from interfering with the plan. This suggested that if the right people within the family knew what was happening, they might be willing to intervene on Charlotte's behalf. The challenge was finding a way to communicate this information to someone who could act on it without exposing himself as the source. James spent days observing the patterns of palace life, identifying when and where he might be able to approach someone with the authority and inclination to protect Charlotte's interests. The risk was enormous. If he approached the wrong person, or if his actions were discovered before they could be effective, he would likely face immediate termination and possible legal consequences for violating his confidentiality agreements. The opportunity finally presented itself during a family gathering that James was assigned to help secure. He observed the interactions between Charlotte and various adult family members, looking for signs of who genuinely cared about her well-being versus those who might be part of the political maneuvering. What he saw gave him hope. There were clearly people within Charlotte's extended family who treated her with genuine warmth and concern, who noticed when she seemed sad or withdrawn, and who appeared to have no knowledge of the plans being made behind the scenes. Prince William, Charlotte's father, was obviously devoted to his daughter, but James had noticed that he was often kept busy with official duties and might not be fully aware of the subtle changes in how palace staff were treating Charlotte. The prince's schedule was carefully managed by the same administrative staff who were implementing Lady Whitmore's plan, which meant they could potentially control what information reached him about his daughter's daily experiences. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, seemed more attuned to Charlotte's emotional state, but she was also dealing with her own complex schedule of public duties and family responsibilities. James had observed her having quiet conversations with Charlotte that seemed focused on the child's feelings and concerns, but it wasn't clear whether she understood the systematic nature of what was happening or if she attributed Charlotte's mood changes to normal childhood phases. After days of careful observation and planning, James made his decision about how to proceed. He would find a way to ensure that Charlotte's parents received accurate information about what was being planned for their daughter, but he would do it in a way that couldn't be directly traced back to him. It was a risky strategy that required perfect timing and a bit of luck, but it seemed like the best chance to protect Charlotte without immediately destroying his own ability to continue watching over her. The plan he developed was elegantly simple. During the next family gathering, he would position himself where he could observe the interactions between Charlotte and her parents, and if the opportunity presented itself, he would find a subtle way to ensure they became aware of their daughter's concerns. It wouldn't involve directly approaching them or explicitly revealing what he had overheard, but rather creating circumstances where they would naturally discover the information themselves. As James refined his strategy, he found himself thinking about the different types of courage that existed in the world. Physical courage was straightforward, the willingness to face danger or pain for a greater good. But what he was contemplating required moral courage, the willingness to risk everything for a principle that might not even be recognized or appreciated by others. It was the kind of courage that didn't come with medals or recognition, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing you had done the right thing when it mattered most. The night before he planned to implement his strategy, James called his wife and had a long conversation with his daughter Sarah. He didn't explain the details of what was troubling him, but he found comfort in hearing about her school day, her friendships, and her excitement about an upcoming birthday party. As he tucked her into bed during a video call, Sarah asked him why he seemed sad, and James told her that sometimes adults had to make difficult decisions to help other children, even when those decisions were scary. Sarah, with the uncomplicated wisdom that children sometimes possess, told him that if someone needed help, then helping them was always the right thing to do, even if it was hard. Her simple moral clarity reminded James why he had chosen this path in the first place. Tomorrow, he would take the first concrete step toward protecting Princess Charlotte, and whatever consequences followed would be worth knowing that he had chosen courage over comfort, principle over self-preservation, and the welfare of a child over the convenience of powerful adults who had forgotten that their authority came with the responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The day James Morrison had chosen to act dawned with deceptive normalcy. The October sun filtered through the London morning mist as he arrived at Kensington Palace, his outward demeanor calm and professional, while his heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct he had developed during years of military service and palace security work told him to abort his plan, to step back from the precipice and maintain the safe anonymity of following orders without question. But every time his resolve wavered, he remembered Charlotte's increasingly subdued demeanor and the cold calculations he had overheard about treating a child's future as a political problem to be managed. The family gathering was scheduled for late afternoon, a seemingly routine meeting about upcoming public engagements that would include several senior royals and their children. James had been assigned to general security oversight, which would position him in areas where he could observe interactions while maintaining his professional distance. What made this particular gathering significant was that it represented one of the last occasions where Charlotte would be included in family discussions before Lady Whitmore's plan to marginalize her was scheduled to begin in earnest. Throughout the morning, James went through his normal duties while mentally rehearsing every aspect of his strategy. He had spent days considering various approaches, from anonymous letters to direct confrontation, before settling on a plan that felt both ethical and practical. Rather than making accusations or revealing classified information, he would create an opportunity for Charlotte's parents to discover the truth naturally, through their own observations and questions. It was a delicate approach that required precise timing and a willingness to trust that parental instincts would ultimately triumph over institutional manipulation. The first sign that his plan might work came during lunch, when James observed Charlotte interacting with her younger brother Prince Louis and their cousin. While the other children played with unconscious energy and joy, Charlotte seemed to hold herself apart, participating but without the natural exuberance that had previously characterized her personality. More telling was the way she glanced at the adults around her, as if constantly gauging their reactions and approval in a manner that seemed premature for a child her age. Maria Santos, the tutor who had confided her concerns to James, was also present for the gathering, and he could see her watching Charlotte with the same worried expression that had prompted their earlier conversation. During a brief moment when they found themselves near each other, Maria quietly mentioned to James that Charlotte had asked her that morning whether she would still need to study languages and history if she wasn't going to represent the family anymore. The comment confirmed James's worst fears. Charlotte was already internalizing the message that her value and future were being diminished, even though no one had explicitly told her what was being planned. As the afternoon progressed, James positioned himself where he could observe the family dynamics during the official gathering. Prince William and Catherine arrived with their typical combination of parental warmth and professional composure, clearly devoted to their children, but also managing the complex demands of their public roles. James watched as they interacted with Charlotte, noting that while their love was evident, they seemed unaware of the subtle changes in their daughter's behavior that had become obvious to those who saw her daily. The critical moment came when Lady Whitmore began discussing adjustments to protocols and schedules for the coming months. She spoke in the coded language of palace administration, using phrases like optimizing arrangements and streamlining responsibilities that sounded innocuous but carried profound implications for the children involved. James watched as Charlotte's expression changed during this discussion, her face taking on the carefully neutral mask that children develop when they're trying to hide hurt or confusion. What happened next was both heartbreaking and revelatory. During a brief break in the formal discussions, Charlotte approached her mother and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether the arrangement changes meant she wouldn't be living with the family anymore. The question clearly shocked Catherine, who immediately knelt down to Charlotte's eye level and asked where such an idea had come from. Charlotte's response, that people had been talking about her needing different arrangements and that her lessons might not matter since she wouldn't be doing important work, sent a visible shock through both parents. James felt his pulse quicken as he realized that his strategy was working exactly as he had hoped. Rather than him having to make accusations or reveal confidential information, Charlotte herself was providing her parents with the evidence they needed to understand what was happening. The child's innocent questions were exposing the emotional manipulation she had been subjected to, and the impact on her parents was immediately apparent. Prince William's reaction was swift and decisive. He requested a private meeting with Lady Whitmore and the other administrators involved in planning Charlotte's future, his tone carrying an authority that made clear this was not a request, but a command. James watched as the power dynamics in the room shifted dramatically, with Lady Whitmore suddenly looking far less confident about her carefully laid plans. The prince's protective instincts had been triggered, and it was obvious that he would not allow his daughter to be treated as a political inconvenience. Catherine's response was equally powerful, but more immediately focused on Charlotte's emotional needs. She spent the remainder of the gathering in quiet conversation with her daughter, asking careful questions about her feelings and experiences over recent weeks. James could see Charlotte gradually relaxing as she realized that her parents were genuinely concerned about her well-being and were not part of the conspiracy to diminish her role within the family. The private meeting between Prince William and the palace administrators lasted for over an hour, and while James couldn't hear the specific conversations, the body language of everyone involved made the outcome clear. Lady Whitmore emerged, looking shaken and defensive, while the prince's expression carried the kind of controlled anger that suggested significant changes were about to occur. Whatever plans had been made for Charlotte's marginalization were clearly being reconsidered in light of parental intervention. Later that evening, as James prepared to end his shift, he received an unexpected request to meet with Prince William privately. His heart raced as he considered the possibilities. Had his role in exposing the situation been discovered? Was he about to face consequences for his actions? Or was this perhaps an opportunity to provide more detailed information about what he had observed? The meeting took place in a small office that James had never entered before, away from the formal reception rooms where most palace business was conducted. Prince William's manner was serious but not hostile. as he began by asking James how long he had been working with Charlotte's security detail and what his general impressions were of her well-being over recent months. The questions were carefully phrased, giving James the opportunity to share his observations without directly accusing anyone of wrongdoing. James chose his words carefully, describing Charlotte's gradual withdrawal, her questions about her own importance within the family, and his concerns about her emotional state. He mentioned conversations with Dr. Harper and Maria Santos, presenting their observations as part of a broader pattern rather than isolated incidents. Throughout his account, he was careful to focus on Charlotte's needs rather than the political motivations of the adults who had been making decisions about her future. Prince William listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. His questions revealed that he was already aware of some aspects of the situation, but had not understood the extent to which his daughter was being affected by adult decisions made without her parents' knowledge. The prince's growing anger was evident, but it was clearly directed at those who had presumed to make plans for Charlotte without consulting her parents, rather than at James for bringing the situation to light. The conversation concluded with Prince William thanking James for his dedication to Charlotte's well-being and assuring him that immediate steps would be taken to address the concerns that had been raised. While he didn't provide specific details about what actions would be taken, his tone made clear that Lady Whitmore's plan to marginalize Charlotte had been definitively rejected, and that consequences would follow for those who had participated in the scheme. As James left the meeting, he felt a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and continued anxiety. He had successfully protected Charlotte from immediate harm and ensured that her parents were aware of what had been planned for her future. However, he also recognized that his actions had likely made him enemies within the palace administration, people who would remember his role in disrupting their plans and might seek opportunities for retaliation. The next few days brought swift and significant changes to the palace dynamics. Lady Whitmore was quietly reassigned to different responsibilities that removed her from involvement with Charlotte's daily life, and several other staff members found their roles similarly modified. New protocols were established requiring parental approval for any significant changes to the children's schedules or living arrangements, effectively preventing future attempts at manipulation without family knowledge. Most importantly for James, Charlotte's demeanor began to improve almost immediately. The uncertainty and anxiety that had been building in her eyes was replaced by her natural curiosity and joy as she realized that her position within the family was secure. She resumed asking questions about everyone around her, sharing her excitement about books and activities, and displaying the kind of carefree happiness that should characterize childhood. During one of their casual interactions a week later, Charlotte thanked James for always being kind to her, mentioning that she had heard her parents talking about how some of the palace staff really cared about the family's well-being. While she couldn't have understood the full significance of what had transpired, her innocent gratitude confirmed for James that he had made the right choice, regardless of any professional consequences he might face. As he drove home that evening, James reflected on the lessons of the past weeks. He had learned that institutional loyalty meant nothing if it required abandoning the people the institution was supposed to serve and protect. He had discovered that moral courage often demanded acting without recognition or reward, trusting that doing the right thing was valuable in itself rather than for any external validation it might bring. Most importantly, he had proven to himself that when faced with a choice between personal safety and protecting an innocent child, he could choose courage over comfort. The decision had required him to risk everything he had worked for, but it had also revealed that some things, like a child's emotional well-being and sense of security, were worth any professional sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but James Morrison could face them knowing that when it mattered most, he had chosen to stand up for what was right rather than what was easy. 3 months after James Morrison's decisive intervention in Princess Charlotte's situation, the palace had settled into a new equilibrium that reflected the hard-won lessons of those turbulent weeks. The autumn had given way to a crisp London winter, and as James walked through the familiar corridors of Kensington Palace, He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had discovered that his principles were stronger than his fears. However, the consequences of his actions continued to unfold in ways both expected and surprising, teaching him that moral courage often comes with a price that extends far beyond the moment of decision. The most immediate and gratifying change was in Princess Charlotte herself. The withdrawn, anxious child who had been questioning her own worth had transformed back into the bright, curious girl who had first endeared herself to the palace staff. Her laughter once again echoed through the corridors. She resumed her habit of sharing biscuits with the guards during their shifts, and, most importantly, she displayed the kind of unconscious confidence that comes from knowing she was valued and protected by the adults around her. When James saw her racing through the gardens with her brothers, completely absorbed in their games, without any of the self-conscious anxiety that had marked her behavior during the crisis, he felt a deep satisfaction that no amount of professional recognition could have provided. Charlotte's academic performance had also improved dramatically once she was no longer worried about whether her education mattered for her future. Maria Santos reported that the princess had thrown herself back into her language studies with enthusiasm, asking whether she could learn additional languages, because she wanted to be able to speak with people from different countries when she grew up. The comment revealed that Charlotte had not only recovered her confidence, but was once again thinking optimistically about her future role within the royal family. The psychological damage that had been inflicted by months of subtle marginalization was healing. But James understood that the scars might have been permanent if the situation had continued unchecked. Prince William and Catherine had responded to the crisis with changes that extended far beyond their daughter's immediate situation. They had instituted new protocols requiring their personal approval for any modifications to their children's schedules, living arrangements, or educational programs. More significantly, they had established regular private meetings with key staff members to ensure that they maintained direct insight into their children's daily experiences rather than relying on administrative summaries that might filter or distort important information. The prince had also made it clear throughout the palace hierarchy that the children's emotional well-being was not subject to political calculation or administrative convenience. During a staff meeting that James had been present for, Prince William had spoken directly about the importance of treating the royal children as individuals with their own needs and feelings, rather than as assets to be managed or problems to be solved. His message was diplomatically phrased but unmistakably firm. Anyone who lost sight of the children's humanity in favor of institutional interests would find themselves seeking employment elsewhere. However, James quickly learned that his victory in protecting Charlotte had created new challenges that would test his resilience in different ways. Lady Whitmore's removal from influence over Charlotte's life had not extended to her broader role within the palace administration, and she had retained enough power to make James's professional life considerably more difficult. While she couldn't retaliate directly without risking questions about her motivations, she could and did make his daily responsibilities more challenging through subtle changes in scheduling, assignment modifications, and the kind of bureaucratic harassment that was difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. James found himself assigned to less prestigious duties, excluded from certain briefings, and subjected to increased scrutiny of his performance in ways that his colleagues began to notice and comment upon. When he arrived for work one morning to discover that his access to certain areas of the palace had been quietly revoked without explanation, he understood that Lady Whitmore was sending a message about the consequences of crossing her authority. The retaliation was professional rather than personal, but it was clearly designed to make him question whether protecting Charlotte had been worth the ongoing damage to his career prospects. The isolation extended beyond administrative harassment to changes in how some of his colleagues treated him. While a few staff members quietly expressed their support for what he had done, others began to maintain more distance from him, apparently concerned that association with someone who had challenged palace hierarchy might reflect poorly on their own standing. The informal conversations that had made long shifts more bearable became less frequent, and James found himself eating lunch alone more often than not, a reminder that moral courage could be a lonely path even when it led to positive outcomes. The psychological impact of this isolation was more significant than James had anticipated. Military service had taught him to value loyalty and camaraderie, and the gradual erosion of collegial relationships left him feeling more isolated than he had expected. There were days when he questioned whether the approach he had taken was the right one, wondering if there might have been a way to protect Charlotte without creating so many professional enemies. The doubt was particularly acute during the long night shifts when he had too much time to think about how his actions had altered his standing within the palace community. Support came from unexpected sources that reminded James why his decision had been worthwhile. Dr. Elizabeth Harper made a point of engaging him in conversation whenever their paths crossed, often mentioning how much Charlotte's improved health and demeanor meant to her as a medical professional. Maria Santos continued to share updates about Charlotte's educational progress, always making sure James understood how his actions had contributed to the child's renewed enthusiasm for learning. These small gestures of recognition couldn't counteract the professional isolation he was experiencing, but they provided crucial reminders that his sacrifice had served a genuinely important purpose. The most meaningful support came from an unexpected source when Catherine, the Princess of Wales, approached him during one of her visits to review security arrangements. She spoke briefly about how much the family appreciated the dedication of their security staff, but her words carried an undertone that made clear she was aware of his specific role in protecting Charlotte. While royal protocol prevented her from being more explicit, her gratitude was unmistakable, and the conversation left James with a renewed sense that his actions had been both necessary and appreciated by the people who mattered most. The situation reached a turning point during a security review meeting where James was asked to provide input on protective protocols for the royal children. Lady Whitmore, still smarting from her defeat regarding Charlotte, attempted to challenge his recommendations in what appeared to be a deliberate effort to embarrass him in front of senior staff. However, her criticism revealed her own lingering resentment about Charlotte's situation, and her barely concealed animosity toward the child became apparent to everyone present. Prince William, who was attending the meeting, immediately intervened with a sharp reminder that security recommendations should be evaluated based on their merit rather than personal considerations. His defense of James was subtle but unmistakable, and the message it sent throughout the palace hierarchy was clear. Attempts to retaliate against staff members who had acted in the children's interests would not be tolerated. Lady Whitmore's influence within the palace began to decline rapidly after that incident, as other staff members recognized that her priorities were not aligned with those of the royal family itself. The vindication James felt was tempered by an understanding that his position within the palace had been permanently altered by the choices he had made. He would never again be seen as simply another security guard following orders without question. Instead, he had established himself as someone whose loyalty extended beyond institutional hierarchy to encompass moral principles that sometimes demanded difficult decisions. This reputation brought both respect and wariness from his colleagues, who recognized that James represented a different model of service that prioritized doing what was right over what was expedient. As winter deepened and the crisis became part of palace history, James found himself reflecting on the broader lessons of his experience. He had learned that institutions, no matter how prestigious or well-intentioned, were only as moral as the individuals who comprised them. The palace's grandeur and centuries of tradition meant nothing if the people within it lost sight of their fundamental responsibility to protect and nurture the children in their care. His intervention had been necessary precisely because the institution's formal structures had failed to prevent adults from treating Charlotte as a political problem rather than a precious child deserving protection. The experience had also taught him about the different types of courage required in various situations. Physical bravery, which he had demonstrated during military service, involved facing external threats with weapons and training. Moral courage, which he had discovered during the Charlotte crisis, required standing alone against institutional pressure armed with nothing but personal convictions and the willingness to sacrifice career advancement for principle. Both types of courage were valuable, but moral courage demanded a more sustained commitment because its challenges could extend for months or years rather than moments. Most importantly, James had learned that the true measure of his character lay not in the recognition he received for his actions, but in his ability to sleep peacefully knowing he had done everything in his power to protect an innocent child when she needed protection most. The professional consequences he had endured were real and ongoing, but they paled in comparison to the knowledge that Charlotte was thriving because someone had been willing to risk everything to ensure her well-being was prioritized over adult convenience. On a particularly cold January evening, as James completed his final rounds before ending his shift, he encountered Charlotte in one of the palace corridors. She was carrying a drawing she had made during art class, and when she saw him, she immediately wanted to show him her latest creation. The picture depicted her family together at what appeared to be a celebration, with everyone smiling and holding hands. When James complimented her artwork, Charlotte explained that it showed how happy she was that everyone was together and that she got to be part of everything important. Her innocent joy and security were the ultimate validation of James Morrison's decision to choose courage over comfort, principle over safety, and the welfare of a child over the approval of powerful adults who had forgotten their most basic responsibilities. As he watched her skip down the corridor toward her parents, completely confident in her place within the family she loved, James understood that some victories were measured not in recognition or reward, but in the simple knowledge that when it mattered most, he had chosen to do what was right rather than what was easy. The price of integrity had been high, but the value of a child's happiness and security had proven to be beyond measure, making every sacrifice worthwhile.